Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on Rediscovering Borderland Socialism, which today is kindly hosted by Historical Materialism and Haymarket Books. My name is Adela Zetterberg. I am the chair of today's panel. I'm an intellectual historian of Marxist social thought, feminism, and social sciences in post-war Eastern Europe. Currently, I join you from Vienna, where I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Imre Kertész College. I'm also a member of the editorial collective of Left East, which is a platform for progressive voices from the post-socialist region and beyond to come together in sustained analytical and political effort. Today's discussion will bring together four authors who have recently written on socialist activists and parties at the crossroads of the Russian and Ottoman empires at the turn of the century. And in their books, they all argued for the central role played by socialists on the imperial margins, be they Poland or Finland or Bulgaria, and also for the need to recover these lost histories, as well as their continued relevance for the present. So in the next 1.5 hours together, we will start with short introductions of the authors and their books, followed by a panel discussion. And after that, I will open the floor for questions from the audience. So please type your questions in the chat of the YouTube video. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And we hope we will have a fruitful and exciting discussion. So I will start by introducing the first author and speaker tonight. Eric Blanc is incoming assistant professor of labor studies at Rutgers University, and he is researching strikes, new workplace organizing, digital labor activism, and working class politics. He has published in 2019 with Verso Books, Red State Revolt, The Teacher's Strike Wave, and Working Class Politics. And today he will be presenting his book, Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire, 1892 to 1917, which came out in 2021 with Haymarket Books. Eric, the floor is now yours.
Great, thanks Adela, and thanks to all panelists. I'm gonna share my screen, and thanks to all of you out there joining us. Let's hope this works. Okay, I'm going to attempt to summarize my very long book in 5 minutes, which is basically impossible. Here we go. The book is called Revolutionary Social Democracy, Working Class Politics Across the Russian Empire. It's based on my archival research in 8 languages. It's mostly a comparison of borderland socialists in Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Latvia, and Finland. Brings in other socialists from the Tsarist Empire as well. And I'm just going to summarize the big picture takeaways from the book, which in addition to sort of telling the story of these parties up through 1921 or so, also tries to make some broader sociological and political takeaways. So the first is a sociological comparison that really centers on a comparison between the Finnish social democracy and other radicals in the empire. The Finnish social democracy was parliamentary focused, had strong organization, was relatively more cautious. Tactically, other radicals like the Bolsheviks, but not just, tended to be insurrectionary, have weak organization, and focus more on mass action tactics. And the explanation I give for this is the Finnish part of the empire had different political regime. It had more political freedoms and had a sort of semi-autonomous parliament, which then shaped the type of socialist politics that existed there. The second comparison is between the outcomes of the 1905 revolution and the 1917 revolution. 1905, the norm was radical-led working class seizures of power and or radical orientations of socialist movements, premised on a break with liberals and capitalists generally. 1917, that becomes much more uneven, in which you have anti-capitalist governments set up in Central Russia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Azerbaijan. And then you have cross-class governments set up in Poland, Ukraine, and in a few other regions. And so the book tries to explain how you could have these disparate revolutionary outcomes given the political regime was stable it was similar across this whole era. And so the explanation I give is essentially a party-based explanation, which is that you can't explain, it's not a sufficient explanation, but it's a necessary explanation. The role of parties as agents of class formation helps explain these disparate outcomes across the Russian Empire, particularly how parties responded to the defeat of the 1905 revolution, and the politics that came from that played a determinative role in the course of the revolution in 1917-18. The historical takeaways, not moving beyond sociology, is just the non-Russian Marxist parties were central. There was actually the majority of Marxists in the imperial Russia were from the non-Russian parties. Here's a list of them. You can peruse it at your leisure later. Similarly, for the course of the revolution itself, the borderlands were far more central than is usually acknowledged. This was true in 1905, in which the conception of revolutionary social democrats, in other words, the left of the Second International, was that the revolution would start in Russia, then spread via the borderlands, particularly through Ukraine and Poland, to the rest of Europe, in particular to Germany. So the conception was a revolutionary expansion westward via the borderlands. And in 1917-18, again, this was the conception of how the revolution would spread. And to a certain extent, it happened. To a certain extent, it also was defeated. A lot of the borderland revolutions ended up being more of a block. The borderland areas became more of a blockage than a passageway for the international revolution. So to understand ultimately the containment of the Russian Revolution, you need to understand what happened in the imperial borderlands. And briefly then, some political takeaways. The big one, one of the big ones is the Bolsheviks weren't that exceptional. There's a founding myth of Leninism, which is that the Bolsheviks had a theoretical and strategic breakthrough. They broke from Second International Marxism, Kautsky. And it turns out when you look at the whole empire, this turns out not to be true. The types of politics that the Bolsheviks implemented and argued for were actually quite relatively common for socialist organizing under the autocratic Russian regime. It was a response largely to that, trying to adapt revolutionary social democracy to autocratic contexts. And then finally, then the takeaway is for socialists thinking about politics today, and I'll end with this, there's really need to be a much deeper engagement with what strategy looks like in different political contexts. It's going to look different. Effective socialist strategy is going to look different in an autocracy. It's going to look different in a low inclusion parliamentary regime like Finland or Germany 100 years ago, or a capitalist democracy today. And so I think we need to be much more rigorous about thinking how political regimes shape effective social practice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric, for the impressive feat of summarizing 600 pages in 5 minutes. And from that, we will now move to the second speaker, who is Wiktor Marget, an assistant professor and project leader in the Institute for Social Studies at the University of Warsaw. Wiktor holds a PhD in sociology and social anthropology from Central European University, then in Budapest. And he is the co-author of From Cotton to Smoke, Łódź, Industrial City and Discourses of Asynchronous Modernity from 1897 to 1994. He also wrote several articles on Poland within the Russian Empire that focus on labor history and the history of concepts. And he currently runs a comparative project on political trajectories of the late Tsarist borderlands. Today, he is here to speak about his monograph, Rising Subjects, the 1905 Revolution and the Origins of Modern Polish Politics, which came out in 2020 with University of Pittsburgh Press. Wiktor, you have the word.
Thank you so much. So I will share the screen fast. And this time we will zoom in. So this approach is much more focused, not only territorially, but also in terms of the focus on real rising subjects, on the working class participants of the revolutionary turmoil of the 1905, and the political experience, which was the share of these people who entered political sphere for the very first time in their lives, and as well entered new realms of public sphere as a class, so to speak. I will start with a quote. And this is a quote which I also used to open the book. this is a depiction of the working class participant who went to the barricade, proverbial place of urban revolution of 1905 in the Russian-controlled Kingdom of Poland. And this is a depiction of political enthusiasm, which was the share of these people who, for the first time, had a feeling to have a share in politics and have a feeling to, let's say, have an impact on their own lives as political subjects. You can first read this quote. I want to actually juxtapose it with another quote, because the book is sort of focused on two threads which are guiding us through this history of the 1905 revolution. And this is the thread of the working class participation and experience of politics, as I said. But there is as well a second side to this. So the reaction on the side of other social groups which were not so enthusiastic about this broadening of political participation. And I as well follow a conservative reaction and sort of fearsome responses of Polish elites to this working class upheaval. So this is one quote which represents this, let's say, working class encroachment into the public sphere. And this is the second quote, which is a response, which is actively pushing out new participants from politics, using various undertones of class hatred, like painted or tainted with anti-Semitic elements, which were as well very strong in this process. And this conservative reaction used anti-Semitic elements massively. And there is a high level of conflict about political visibility. So the question is, who has the right to participate in politics? And I try to follow this question through several chapters. And the chapters are following the story of emerging working class public sphere. So I start with the depiction of particular intellectual and communicative circuit between workers and intelligentsia, radical intelligentsia, which was trying to mobilize the workers of industrial towns of Russian-controlled Kingdom of Poland. It did it in various directions, in various ways. There is a competition of various modes of socialism, and as well large presence of working class nationalism. So this public sphere is highly fractured. And later I go on to follow the modes of participation of these working class subjects which entered the public sphere. And I follow various practices which they use to give voice or take voice for themselves as public meetings, as various forms of mass protest. And I try as well to follow the, let's say, fine-grained communicative circuit, which allowed these people to enter the world of letters, and gave them for the first time concepts which they used to comprehend this political reality and the social reality in more abstract terms, which allowed them to sort of mobilize everyday experiences for the sake of more, let's say, definite political activity. So the third chapter is about political leaflets as a main means of communication between party activists and working class adherents, as well very antagonistic public sphere constituted by these printings. So I follow various forms of these printings, various ways in which they tried to mobilize people, and as well created in writing particular forms of subjectivity. And this public sphere of leaflets was as well very antagonistic. So I will follow various alternative lines of division and various alternative identities which were thrown into this public sphere. And the fourth chapter takes a biographical approach. So I try to follow autobiographical accounts which were written later, but still carry sort of a layered experience of this political involvement. And one can actually excavate or retrace various layers which made these people political activists in the time of writing. So I try to see how this 1905 experience took its impact on political lives of various as well political activists from various political views. And the final chapter gets back to this conservative reaction. This is exactly the analysis of the depiction of working class politics from outside, from the point of view of, let's say, bourgeois press, and the ways working class participants were actively pushed out from the public sphere, as the second quote I presented today indicated. And this is more or less the story of these turbulent 2 years, which were failed revolution according to the, let's say, standard socio-historical definitions of revolution. But nonetheless, they were very intense in terms of actual biographical experience of people who, for the very first time, entered politics. And it was as well a critical juncture for shaping broader political formations. So the political landscape and these like cleavages in the public sphere in the forthcoming years or maybe even decades were shaped by this confrontation in 1905. And on this note, I would like to pass the voice further. Thank you.
Thank you, Wiktor. I will move us from one borderland to another and now introduce our third speaker, Maria Todorova, who is Professor Emerita at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She teaches and researches the history of Eastern Europe, especially the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire in the modern period. And some of her major works include Scaling the Balkans, essays on Eastern European entanglements, Bones of Contention, and Imagining the Balkans, as well as Balkan family structure and European pattern. She has also edited several volumes on remembering communism and is currently working on a modern history of the Balkans. Today, she is introducing her book, The Lost World of Socialists at Europeans' Margins, Imagining Utopia, 1870s to 1920s, which came out in 2020 with Bloomsbury. You are muted. You are still muted. You will have to unmute yourself.
So thanks, Adela. I really feel privileged, having gone through the other three books, to have been invited to an already existing circle of colleagues and friends, and may I say maybe comrades, in any way. I'm not going to share a screen. I'm the old type, but I'm also not going to do a summary, but I'm the author of this book. What I would like to do is two things. To tell you how I saw the work when I started it and how I see it now when the book is out. So when I began, I did not have a project. I did not have a proposal. I did not have a hypothesis. I did not have a methodological instrumentarium. All the desiderata that we are imposing on our graduate students. So I was sitting in the Sofia archive working on something completely different when I stumbled upon a cache of documentation from the archives of the Communist Party, which was closed in 1989, and all the archives passed to the state archives. This collection of over 4,000 documentary sources were classified as memoirs, but they encompass different genres. Some were memoirs par excellence, very many critical, very few published, some with a red pencil saying forbidden or not for free use. Others were handwritten diaries and also correspondence dating back to the 1870s. Now, the history of the archive in itself is a fascinating story, ranging from donations to purchased acquisitions, to commissioned pieces. So all of this aptly demonstrates this intersection between official and personal memory. And this enormously rich source was completely neglected and considered by my fellow historians as being trash. So I started rummaging through the trash, simply reading it, and the sources seduced me in trying to find a home for them. So I like to quote Picasso, who says, "Je ne cherche pas, je trouve." I'm not looking for things, I find. So these sources just came to me. So today, when the book is out, I see it broadly as an emancipatory project. What do I hope that it emancipates? Firstly, it problematizes the general ideological descriptions that rely on silencing and erasure of the liminal. The marginal is not erected by me as a radical alternative to the, or something which entirely displaces the dominant paradigm, but it is also not simply to add or enrich this paradigm, but to show that it often has constitutive powers and to alert to the losses we incur by dismissing the periphery and the erasure of possible alternative. Secondly, I hope it emancipates different historical approaches away from the binary dismissal of previous ones. So as we know, narrative history was unseated, we embraced social and quantitative one, then number crunching was dismissed and we embraced the linguistic turn. Then we are back to the body, environment, and big global and digital history. So looking down on the petty detailed descriptions. So what I hoped with this book is to show that all of these methods are valid, that different scales of analysis require different methods and are based on different sources, and that all scales of observations are legitimate. And so my three parts and the different chapters are built around these different approaches. Thirdly, let me go to my third thing. Thirdly, I think that unintendedly I'm emancipating also the nationally based approach, which is not necessarily inimical to comparative history. It has been for a long time the mantra, especially in European history, to compare two or more cases, but in order to overcome methodological nationalism. But with very, very few exceptions, the result is asymmetrical and lacks the insights of thick description. So I think that one can put the national in a web of broader connections and not sacrifice the specific. Fourthly, the top-down examination of interpolation to the individual level is reversed in favor of individual close-ups, emphasizing how thought/emotion shapes one's individual agency. And this grounding in individuals, essentially producing a, archival, historical ethnography from the archives, is a methodology which I think provides a reminder against inference and terminological slippage. And finally, and fifth, and most obvious, it is an attempt to emancipate the people who shared the socialist ideal, men and women, and recuperate the appeal of socialist ideology and the utopia implicit in it. So this is how I see the work now. When it is finished, and I look back to it, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. As we now will move to the fourth and final presentation, I just wanted to remind our audience that we are collecting questions in the chat of the YouTube channel. So please write them down and we will get to them after the panel discussion. And with that, I give the word to our fourth and final presenter, who is Risto Turunen. He holds a doctorate in history from Tampere University and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Warsaw. Risto specializes in computational and data-intensive approaches, so data crunching, to modern political languages, and he has published articles on labor history, conceptual history, and digital humanities. His book, Shades of Grey, Evolution Shades of Red, evolution of the political language of Finnish socialism from the 19th century until the Civil War of 1918, came out last year in Helsinki. Risto, the floor is yours.
Good evening, people. So it's almost bedtime here in Finland, but I try to stay awake and sharp. Let's see if I can share my screen. Can you see? Maybe you can see. Good. So if I had to sum it up in one sentence, in this book, in my best and only book so far, Shades of Red, I read both printed and handwritten newspapers to better understand the intellectual history of Finnish socialism. And in addition to classical humanities approaches, I also applied a lot of computational methods in this book, such as word frequencies over time. And like the title suggests, I studied the evolution of socialism. And by evolution, I refer to three different kinds of evolution. To diachronic evolution, that is how socialism changes over time. Then to vertical evolution, that is the ideological differences and similarities between the top and the bottom of the labor movement. And also to ideological co-evolution, meaning the relation of socialism to other major political languages of the time. And I'm not going to walk you through the entire argument, but I will next try to give you very short answer to each of these three forms of evolution. So first, considering the evolution over time, with the help of computer and machine-readable labor press, I was able to show that there was surprisingly large variation in the use of socialist concepts over time. In this figure here, you see 6 different conceptual themes that I have manually constructed. So basically, the figure shows the proportion of an individual conceptual theme in relation to all themes. For example, you can see here that the liberal influences in the beginning of the labor movement were strong in the beginning of the labor movement in the 1890s, or you can see that discourses around fatherland are strongest at the turn of the 20th century, and so on. Based on this, I would say that the political language of Finnish socialism, it was not a stable thing, but a constant process with many, many different periods. Then let's move to the vertical evolution. When I began to write my history of socialism, I wanted to make sure that the common people have a voice in my narrative. By common people, I mean simply those people who had to work for a living, those people who could not write their ideas on a paper for a living. So I'm talking about factory workers, I'm talking about housemates, I'm talking about agrarian workers and so on. But the problem was this, how to find their ideas in the archives. Well, luckily, there was a boom of handwritten newspapers in Finland in the early 20th century. These papers were written by the ordinary workers in their free time and read aloud in their mass meetings. So these papers, they were a great source for me to study the proletarian imagination. And my general conclusion is that the ideological differences between the top and the bottom of the Finnish labor movement have been exaggerated in the previous research. I will maybe tell about this later today. Finally, the third form of evolution, that is the ideological co-evolution. So I argue that one important factor in the rise of Finnish socialism was its conceptual flexibility, its ability to steal concepts from its political opponents. Socialists claimed that they were more liberal than the liberals themselves, for socialists demanded that the concept of equality must be extended to all spheres of human life. And they also claimed to be more Christian than the conservative Christian church, for they applied the teachings of Christ to the practical life. And of course, socialists also were more patriotic than anyone else in Finland, for socialism meant love for fatherland and love for the whole humanity, whereas bourgeois nationalists, they only used the concept of fatherland to justify their own exploitation of the working people. So all in all, I argue that although this redness of Finnish socialism, it might look harsh in isolation, in the context of Finnish modernity as a whole, the socialist shades of red, they blend in with other ideological colors of the period. I know that this book is definitely not the final word on Finnish socialism. It has been studied a lot before me and Erik, and it will be studied more in the future. But if you got interested, you can find the book really available online. Thank you.
Thank you, Risto. And again, to all four of you, it has been really a pleasure to read your books. And now it will be even nicer to be able to moderate a discussion between the four of you. Of course, the books speak to each other in very interesting ways, and already from your presentation, it's clear that they intersect. But what I wanted to do, just to guide us a bit through the next 45 minutes or so, is to go into more detail into three main themes that came out from your presentations as well. And these would be the historiographical, the biographical, and the political. To start us off with the historiographical question, I was wondering whether you could speak to the very concept or notion of borderland socialism, and specifically to how your books and the histories that you reconstruct unsettle very fixed historiographical ideas about political modernity beyond the Western experience, or ideas about working class mobilization at the turn of the century, or about political languages and political subjects and political organizing in times of revolution. So can you speak with each other and for yourself as well to some of these unsettling historiographical insights from your histories? And I think of this question in two ways, partly as partly in terms of how borderland histories shift established narratives, but also in terms of how they shift the epistemic conditions for academic research into supposedly marginal histories. So this would be a bit the meta question. I will open the floor to you. And I hope that you will engage with each other as well. And in the meantime, that the audience will get input and insight for their own questions.
Okay. Can I jump in simply in order to be a little bit more contrary, because I'm not using the notion of borderland socialism. And I will explain why, so the others can, of course, engage with that. Our poster, of course, is about socialist activists as the crossroads of the Russian and Ottoman empires. And in this sense, it is geographically true and appropriate, except that the borderlands of the Russian Empire were different from the borderlands of the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, the socialism that I'm describing and the Balkan socialism was already not a borderland socialism. It was outside of the empire, although it did have the influence of the empire. So I prefer the notion of periphery because it is more abstract. It does not link it to a particular geography, and it is not limited to the imperial legacy. But periphery, I use it because the notion of core periphery is a relational concept. Anything can be a core and anything can be a periphery. And as others have pointed out, economic geography is not political geography intellectual geography, or cultural geography, and they're completely different. As I said, I wanted to show that this silencing of the periphery dismisses alternatives and comes as an impoverishing cost. But periphery meant also Italy and Spain and Ireland and all the other cases, not simply the borderlands of empires. Why? Because at this particular moment of time, the core of socialism was Germany and less so France. But in other times, it shifted and it was somewhere else. It could become Moscow in some ways. So the core shifts and the periphery accordingly shifts too. So this as far as the epistemology goes, and when it comes to examples, I can also chip in some.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for bringing in this question of center and periphery. I will just jump in. This is unplanned. I will jump in just to invite Eric to maybe reflect on this also, because one of the questions in the chat refers exactly to this question of center and periphery. And specifically, Eric, you are asked about the importance of bordering more developed capitalist societies. And the question here is if some of the borderlands, like the Baltic states, were more developed than Central Russia in terms of production for forces, and how that contributed to different goals and ambitions. So I can.
So thanks, Mary. I think that's really fruitful. When writing, part of the tricky thing is we're writing about different empires. And so within the context of the Russian Empire, I like Borderlands precisely because the periphery has certain connotations of underdevelopment and margin, which is not universally true in the Russian Empire. The really short version is the unevenness of borderland regions, like Latvia was certainly, by all accounts, more sort of famously more developed than Central Russia as far as like the size of its urban and rural working class. And so a lot of people, including the Borderland socialists there, believe that would be, socialism would find its highest peak there. And you can make a similar case for Poland to a certain extent, and maybe even Finland to a certain extent, depending on how you're judging development as far as the level of proletarianization. Maybe not big factory workers, but so Finland's maybe, it would be interesting to hear what Risto, certainly Finnish socialists, as far as conceived of themselves as more advanced than Central Russian. So the periphery there, the borderland as just like a specific geographic entity maps on better across the board for the different socialists who weren't in Central Russia, which did have like a very definite meaning, as far as just who was in Moscow, who's in St. Petersburg. And just the last thing I will say on that is, I think it's really helpful to not fetishize and like reify borderland socialism as a thing. A big part of what I try to do in the book is show the extent to which socialists in all of these regions, at least the left-wing socialists, really in particular, were trying to implement like classical Orthodox Second International Marxism. They adapted that to their specific contexts, but I think overall it was much less of a national story than is usually told. The historiography tends to really tell these as separate national stories. And when it just as one anecdotal thing is when you read the history of Finnish socialism or even Polish socialism to a certain extent, whenever Kautsky gets referenced, it seems to be like some sort of exceptional thing. Unlike the Central Russians, unlike the Bolsheviks, people here were like more European and more interested in reading Kautsky. And it turns out, well, no, everyone was reading Kautsky. Like that was the guy, and then they implemented it. So I think that's more interesting than to see the extent to which practical divergences happened, that it wasn't necessarily rooted in high ideological questions, but then you can start asking interesting questions about what about the specific context locally shifted the practices accordingly.
Yes, if I may continue on from what Maria and also Eric said there before, it seems to me also that these objective world maps and subjective maps of social reality that people have, they can be very, very far from each other. For example, I studied one paper published by a local workers association in a tiny village located in a remote area. And these men and women, they truly believed that the future of the world depended on their choices. They wrote messages like, the whole proletariat of the world is now watching us, how actively we work towards socialism here. which was hardly the case in reality. And also when you read their text carefully enough, you will notice the richness of international sources in their political thinking. So it's not only Marxist ideas from Germany combined with the teachings of Christ. There's also non-socialist influences such as American freethinkers and French revolutionaries from the 18th century. So in my opinion, how does this challenge the prevailing narratives we have? Then in many interpretations of at least Finnish socialism, these intellectual lives of the ordinary working people, they are quite limited, to say the least. For example, agrarian socialism has been portrayed as simple-minded greed for land, or as a naive dream of getting rich very quickly. But my perhaps more epistemological point would be here that if you don't read any sources written by the workers, you can very easily reflect your own biases towards these masses. You can reflect your own biases towards the masses on these historical people. But when you actually read some writings from these people, you will understand that their understanding of socialism in the grassroots of socialism, in the grassroots of political thinking, it was much more complex and more international than what you would perhaps expect based on reading previous research.
Go ahead, Wiktor.
Yeah, okay, so now my turn. So let me start with the question of categories. I think that both peripheries and borderlands are actually categories which are loaded, and they have very problematic legacies. The legacy of the concept of periphery and its entanglement in center periphery as a theory, but as well as a certain model of, let's say, global intellectual circulation, or maybe as well this reality of means of production, so to speak, is one thing. But Borderland is as well a loaded category. It's a category loaded with, let's say, geopolitical legacies. So these are borderlands of certain empire or contested borderlands, and very often what goes within it is exactly this sort of very questionable legacy of imperial entanglement in certain, or adherence to a certain sphere of influence. And that's why I would like to maybe leave behind these both categories, and maybe we can speak about something which may be provisionally dubbed a lateral form of thinking, lateral form of socialism. And I would like to address these lateral forms of thinking on 3 levels at this point. So it could be analyzed, I think, as a sort of a condition of action and condition of thinking for the historical actors. And certainly there are forms of thought and forms of political practice which are very innovative, and they sort of go against the grain, established habits of, as well, for instance, Second International. And these people were facing conditions which were different than conditions where more things fit to each other. So they were exposed to challenges, and they were forced to think politically through these challenges. For instance, adapting more creatively, for instance, questioning things which were taken for granted in other dominant forms of socialist reflection, and so on and so forth. And this is a sort of epistemic privilege for the actors, perhaps, which makes them interesting. There is as well a lateral privilege as an analytical category, because we can see more analyzing these lateral areas. Yeah, so we can exactly question the categories which were forged in respect to, let's say, more coherent social formations, where standard concepts and standard theories were developed, and we can sort of look at them with very fine-grained comparisons to test certain assumptions and to see as well more. This would be our epistemic lateral thinking. And there is a third level, which is the laterality of academic production. And this is, I think, not a coincidence that all these 4 books are written in very particular circumstances. So 3 of us have written these books as our first books, as books.
Last.
Exactly, not last, but like, and there is a 4th book by Maria, which is a sort of a book written by an extremely established star of the field, when you do not need to sort of, let's say, present yourself with a topic which is in high demand. Yeah, so you can allow yourself for this freedom. And the other 3 of us has written it for this sort of, let's say, maybe youthful passion even. But now all of us as well went further in a way. Yeah, Eric goes to labor relations today. Risto goes to digital humanities. I go to comparative historical sociology and whatever parliamentary studies. And this is as well not a coincidence, I think, that there was a case of quite many labor scholars as well.
Absolutely.
That they sort of moved to other disciplines. But I want to end with a note that maybe can let us abandon this literality in a way. So if we consider actually these conditions we all were researching, this is actually a global wave of revolutions, starting in 1905 in Russia, going through all the Russian borderlands, as we say, spreading through the Black Sea with roving revolutionaries through Azerbaijan, through Iran. This is the constitutional revolution in China, in Portugal, in Mexico, spanning through the next 5-7 years. And these events are entangled. They have a very similar idea of, let's say, constitutional revolution behind. And after all, if we consider the global condition and relationship of social forces in quite many parts of the globe, for instance, the struggle of popular revolt, which is contained by the sort of frightened elite, and this sort of social formation with a dominant intelligentsia or sort of let's say outgrown elite, which is trying to exactly secure their privileges, even if they to some extent use the popular insurgency to liberalize their own states, or maybe change the position of these states on the global level to make them more independent, for instance, in terms of relationship with the superpowers. And this condition, if we define it as a sort of exactly a layout of social forces, is perhaps much more dominant and not at all peripheral or borderland condition, but is much more typical on the global scale than the standard, whatever depiction of social historical relationships, which was built upon the story of the Western states. Thank you.
Can we still go on? So I do agree with you, but I would probably push it back to the Paris Commune and even back to 1848 and include the second half of the 19th century and not begin necessarily with 1905. I think there is a strong pedigree of all these elements going back to the 19th century. I still would defend the notion of periphery, although I agree with you that it's a burden thing. And the reason I am defending it because it has been criticized for its economism, but we can explode it from within by insisting on the contribution of the periphery. And I see this link between especially the work of Risto, where we are describing 2 rural countries which have the strongest socialist movements. Finland, with a huge party and huge voting, socialist vote, and Bulgaria also with a very, very strong party. And this is challenging this cliche and this stereotype that socialism should be typical only for industrialized factory worker countries, which is unfortunately reproduced even in East European books at large. So I'm not going to mention them, but we are making this exception, and I'm so glad that I'm not a soloist here, and it's wonderful. It is the passion, but it is also in the zeitgeist. I was just at the conference in Athens on temporality and modernity, and believe me, 90% of the contributions were on labor history. So it's there. It is already here.
All right, so if Maria defended center periphery, do we have any pending defenses of Borderlands? I think, Risto, you are the only one remaining who could defend.
No, but we are defending the Borderlands, but not the concept.
If not, then I will take Wiktor's lead, who was so kind to socialize the panel and already discuss biographies. And I will move us to the second part of the discussion, which has to do with this biographical aspect that is very present in all of your books. And so we have a lot of biography, we have a lot of generational accounts, prosopographical accounts, and also attention to how people lived, what were their commitments, what were their ideas, and also, interestingly, their emotions, their imagination, and this messiness of day-to-day politics. And so I wanted you to reflect and discuss about the importance of these individual and collective biographies that you recover, but also a bit about what were the challenges to recover them. Also because your books are often very touching in the way that they integrate this kind of biographical material, I wanted to give you the chance, if you wish, to also give one example of an individual or collective subject that you think exemplifies your history or your story through their life trajectory. So I will open this to whomever feels inspired to start.
I can start this time, as I guess that my book is, I think, with Maria's, one of the two most biographical, so to speak. Yeah? So there is this chapter which is purely autobiographical, so to speak, and I was as well very inspired by sort of a spiritual odyssey of certain persons which I recovered. Exactly, this was this story of sources leading me a bit. And yeah, so maybe I will start from this example from the person which is here inspiring. Yeah? So let me take one baker who wrote a memoir later, and this is exactly this touching moment when a person is writing about discoveries, about this sort of like incomprehensible stubbornness in recovering elements from various like scratchy moments which were on his disposal, because there were no books in the library he could read. He was forced with he was sort of confronted with inability to understand what he is reading. Yeah? So there are these fascinating stories of either a peasant child picking up scraps of newspapers burned somewhere in the fireplace, or thrown out from whatever the house of the priest who died for cholera. So they were burning all the things after this priest, and some of them were not properly burned. So a village child was picking up these scraps to read them, yeah, and sort of reconstruct the world of letters from there. And there are this type of stories, and there are stories of people, yeah, excited with the smell of the printing ink when they for the first time were able to buy a newspaper, for instance. Yeah, and here these leaflets were very important means of communication, because this was very often the first point of contact with the written world. So they were read aloud in broader circles, and they were commented and explained. Yeah, so there is this very interesting intellectual circuit between participants. It not always was a intelligentsia party, whatever party functionary who explained the world, but this is very often a relatively horizontal communication when people try to understand with each other what's written there. And these stories sort of kept me going, and they are as well appearing as recollected stories in autobiographies. And here I go to the difficulties with how to recreate these stories, because actually there is not so many very direct sources. So, for instance, these are not even diaries which were written day by day. These are, in my case, autobiographies which were written later by a sort of a ready-made working class intellectual subject. So already a member who was mobilized and socialized politically within a socialist culture. Maybe even he or she was writing already in times of state socialism, but this was a sort of an official biography. So there are very many layers of accumulated experience, politics of writing, various constraints which were making these people to be who they were. Yeah, and the exciting thing is exactly to try to retrace or maybe excavate these layers which are accumulated upon each other. And here one has to reconstruct various angles. So, for instance, we know what was the language of leaflets written by party intelligentsia. So this is as well not a direct insight in the subjectivity of a worker beginning a political career. But we know this language. And we know, for instance, later, or we can assume, that this particular layer in the autobiographical writing is coming from these leaflets. But there is as well another vocabulary, which is, for instance, typical for later official socialist propaganda in state socialism after 1945. And we can see how these layers sometimes are opposed to each other and how people are actually speaking languages, so to speak. And these are different languages, even if all of them can be classified as socialist languages. And so this is the puzzle. This is the fun of course, very risky. Yeah? You never know if you're really right to sort of pinpoint these particular elements, but you still see something which is an exciting story speaking through a particular person. Thank you.
I will give the word then, if nobody dares. I was wondering, Risto, because you deal with, as you've already described, with a lot of these people that usually don't appear in our histories. I was wondering how you got to them. So tell us a bit about how you recovered your subject.
Yes, I did not go very deep into the histories of individual persons who speak throughout my book. But in the case of these handwritten newspapers, for example, I rather analyzed these workers as some kind of a collective subject. I wanted to know what kind of political ideas unite these people, these different kinds of workers. So just to make this more concrete for you, if a maid, a factory man, and a crofter from the countryside, if they come together for a pint, what kind of political ideas and political concepts unite their thinking? And believe it or not, the greatest practical challenge for me was to distinguish authentic proletarian messages in these handwritten newspapers from the copy-pasted messages. So, okay, this might sound trivial, but this problem of copy-pasting, it actually had major consequences for my own historical argumentation. So when I was reading these handwritten messages, I very soon realized that it's impossible that all of these messages could have their origin in the local proletarian imagination. There were strange words and strange topics that made me think that some of these texts could have been stolen from other sources. And then when I did some keyword searching in the digital collections of the National Library of Finland, I found that many of the handwritten texts were copied directly or with some revisions from the printed sources, most often from the printed labor newspapers. So why is this important then? Well, there is one quite influential interpretation of Finnish socialism, which claims that the socialist ideology was rational, educational, and theoretical at the top of the labor movement, but it transformed in the vengeful hate speech at the crossroads. But I argue, based on my close readings of partly the same handwritten newspapers this scholar used in his book, that this strong contrast between enlightened socialism at the top and emotional socialism at the bottom, it is way too dramatic. So if he claimed that grassroots socialism was very local and authentic and archaic in its nature, I claim that grassroots socialism was mediated instead of authentic and modern instead of archaic. And to build this argument, I use these connections that I found between the print and the handwritten media as concrete evidence.
I'll go real quick. My book is probably the most zoomed out of the four. That being said, one of the things that really, I guess, surprised me, or that through doing a lot of the archival research and just reading way more on this, that became more clear to me over the years of doing the research, was the extent of the biographical transformation of the 1905 revolution, and in particular, like the period that immediately came after, just comes off as over and over and over again extremely central to the trajectories of militants and leaders and individual workers. The revolution itself is maybe intuitive, although there is a tendency oftentimes to focus more on 1917-18. But certainly, like the period of reaction, as is called sometimes, and the years immediately following the revolution is just like this pivotal moment in which people try to make sense of what had just occurred. And to be honest, I find this analytically to be one of the more puzzling parts of the history to explain, because it's the least determined. You know, I don't have like a strong theory or a strong argument really for what explains who ends up where on these debates after the revolution. Because one of the, the general trend, as I mentioned before, is for most parties, and Finland was actually the exception here. Finland, the party gets more radical as a whole through the 1905 revolution. That's extremely exceptional. The norm, the norm is either maintaining a revolutionary line like the Bolsheviks, or even to a certain extent moderating it. You could say the Bolsheviks moderated a bit, or becoming more significantly more moderate, like looking for alliances with liberals. And in part, this is like a dramatic biographical trauma. So if you read biography of Polish leaders, I'm sure Wiktor can assess this, there's this sense that we were crushed, and it's this soul-searching existential angst of not repeating defeat leads to a search for new allies. And that is not just political. There's some sort of emotional, deeply traumatic, personal, political crisis that I don't know how you explain who chooses to kind of like stick with the good time Marxist faith and who starts looking for new allies. It seems undetermined to me. And one of the things I would hope, for future researchers, and I try to like in the footnotes point to this in the book, is if somebody can figure out why different parties and different individual leaders came to the assessments they did, if there's some sort of sociological or political pattern I've missed, I would love to hear it, because that would make me feel better about causality and explanation. I just couldn't find it.
So just to take up from Eric, this is great. Mine is probably the most zoomed in of the books. If yours is the most zoomed out. And I didn't, I had not planned to speak on it because I'm actually against the notion of an exemplary trajectory, precisely because you cannot find causality. A sociological causality. It is so diverse. So in my second part, where I'm using quantitative analysis, prosopography, and doing graphs and this and that, I immediately juxtapose it to narratives, because the quantitativeness is good, but it tends to model things, and the narrative breaks the model, and it shows this diversity and unpredictability. And the reason I can tell you wonderful biographies, but first of all, I don't want to waste our time, but also because people usually latch on my first, on the chapter of, the first chapter of my third part, which is a very picturesque biography of a peasant teacher. And then they immediately start generalizing about peasant teachers in Bulgaria. No, she was a sociological exception, except that as an example, it is so wonderfully picturesque that you have to write a whole chapter on her. So as a collective biography, it is the biography of an intelligentsia, not necessarily high intellectuals, but intelligentsia as a whole. And I insist on this unpredictability and on the fact that we cannot and we should not try to find a sociological causality about human behavior. There are other, it's so rich, the causal thing of human behavior, that we should not model it. Although in terms of quantitativeness, and I actually very much enjoyed Risto's thing, so I'm not against that. But when I was doing my prosopography, the one thing that came out from this quantitative thing was the overwhelming presence of lawyers among socialists. I could actually catch that even without doing the computation, but the computation, of course, makes it more convincing, and it's a nice illustration. People really believe when you give them a graph rather than tell them things. And the reason is very simple. It's because law was a free profession, and people could not be just capriciously fired. Most of them wanted to be teachers and teach hard sciences, because this is physics and biology and whatnot. But they became lawyers in order to be able to work, to do their socialist work, because this is a free profession. So here you have a sociological explanation. But the way people are becoming socialists, and this to me was a wonderful question, mostly from schools. That is the sociological given. But the individual choices are amazingly beautiful, and I would like to keep this bouquet, diverse.
Wonderful. And I only have one question left. So this is a warning to the audience that now is the time to type down your questions if you have any. And my last question has to do with the political relevance of these histories for today. So I think you all make a stronger or weaker argument about why the socialist ideas and political practices of the turn of the century are still relevant to us. I wanted to ask you how, and I also wanted to ask you a bit the other side of this question, which is what of these ideas are still with us, unacknowledged or not, and continue to have sway on our political imagination.
I guess I can go. My impression is my book is most zoomed out. It's probably also the most specifically tries to make a political intervention. It's primarily a historical and sociological book, but the impetus surely was like trying to grapple with essentially the strategic legacy of the Russian Revolution. Like that was my familial and political upbringing, was very much in like Leninism and in the Trotskyist tradition specifically. And the book took 10 years to kind of like disentangle and figure out what I actually thought of all this. And writing the book changed a lot of my opinions. The big political takeaways, I think, one of them is not specific to Leninism and these debates, but which is just trying to make actually kind of a straightforward case for the importance of working class parties, that a lot of both politics today, it assumes away the irrelevance of that certain type of project of like the working class political party, that, you know, this is irrelevant. And one of the interesting things go back 100 years, is you see these mass working class parties in places in which certainly the industrial proletariat was not the overwhelming majority of the population in any of these countries we were studying, or these regions we were studying. And so there's actually some sort of intuition there that you don't just need mass Fordism to have a viable think. And I try to show that by looking at the various outcomes, how they're different in places in which certainly the economy didn't shift in a lot of these areas dramatically between 1905 and 1917. And some borderland areas they did because of the war, but it's hard to make a strong 1917 without looking at the role of parties. So making a case for party as something that is working class specifically is relevant. And then just as far as the big strategic debates over the Russian Revolution, in some ways the book is in its narrowest, most sectarian sense, a polemic against Leninism, not in like an anti-communist sense. I try to make the argument that Leninists and the Bolsheviks, it was actually a very appropriate democratic and mass formation for the context of an autocratic regime. The argument overall is just that it's not a universally relevant strategy. And maybe for listeners that's obvious, but there's still a lot of people and a lot of really amazing activists who still believe this to be true, and who spend a lot of time assuming either that the Leninist model is still replicable, or now, interestingly, that like the Kautskyist model, like Second International, is relevant. And part of the polemic there is also, I think that type of politics in the very classical German sense was also very much rooted in like the type of regime that existed in Germany and Finland, which are very similar regimes, I think, and that are not particularly relevant, or they're not as relevant as some activists might think, for context of capitalist democracy. So the book overall, I think, is trying to push socialists and radical activists to think more rigorously about what an appropriate mass socialist politics looks like for a capitalist democracy, in part by showing how rooted both like the classic Kautskyist tradition was in like low inclusion parliamentary regimes, and how Leninism was so deeply rooted in autocratic context.
Yeah, okay, if there is some space, I can jump in. So of course, even if it's maybe not very visible, the political stakes were somehow orienting my thinking and writing. And I think that there are two important things which I sort of tried to tackle as well for myself, trying to understand certain dynamic of politics, so to speak, taking this 1905 intrusion and popular insurgency as a sort of a laboratory of political visibility, I would say. So there is this question of active renegotiation of limits of politics in respect to topics which are political, in respect to people who have the right to speak in their name and to have the right to be in public, for instance, which is extremely heavily contested, both in class terms and in ethnic terms. So there are these countless expressions of actively pushing out Jewish participants from the public sphere, which is just like visually shocking for the Polish nationalist public opinion, but as well for some liberal or even socialist leaders, and for negotiation of which practices are political and how you can participate, how you can take part sort of public activity. And this was something which I really got interested into, and this was somehow relevant to the debates even in contemporary public sphere, where for instance like various groups as well are sort of contested with their public being in certain contexts, be it in racial terms in the US, or more class-oriented terms in Poland, where, for instance, like when I was writing this, there were these social transfers organized by the actually right-wing nationalist government, which actually offered certain groups of people access to practices which were not available for them before, as, for instance, going to the seaside, because they got like cash inflows. And it sort of shocked the liberal public opinion who usually populated these touristic resorts. And there were various very nasty languages mobilized to sort of scorn and push out these people from this leisure participation. So, and these sort of things kept me going as well while writing. And the second thing is this liability or certain maybe fluidity of political mobilization. So there is this very powerful reconfiguration going on, which is connected with this conservative reaction after 1905. But it's not only pushing out of working class contenders from above, but this is as well, to some extent at least, a remobilization, sort of giving sense to disappointment, giving sense to a crushed revolution, and offering new senses through a nationalist and sometimes virulently anti-Semitic right, which gave sense to these disappointments and sort of remobilized people. We not always know if these were exactly the same people, but there is this political mobility of let's say popular contention, and this was as well very, very interesting for me, exactly as a lesson to be learned for today as well. Thank you.
Risto, Maria, would you like to?
No, not really. I mean, why is it relevant? Because we are living now at the end of the neoliberal covenant, and all these ideas are relevant. This is why these books are appearing. Now, you also, and why do we look back at this particular period? Because it was the golden age of European socialism. That's it. It finished with the First World War. It crushed actually with the way the socialists became nationalists very quickly, and I actually very much like, again, both Risto's idea that all these ideologies were very much linked together. They were not opposing each other. Nationalism was imbued in socialism, although, of course, the mantra is that it is only internationalist. It was a nationalist story, even though it was socialist. And why is it relevant today? Because it is, in fact, in some ways, the heroic and peaceful stage of socialism. So people are looking back at it with some nostalgia and some utopia, but the ideas are the same. The ideas are about social justice, and that's what we want to bring from the past again. So. It is the same ideas of socialism, but it is the concrete implementations of these same ideas that can surprise us, and where we are working and showing them. But as a whole, it is these same ideas, including Leninism. So, in some cases, it is also appropriate. I'm looking at some of the questions here about the agrarian economies, and they don't generate alternatives for forms of socialist thought. The socialist thought is the same, but the implement. Usually, we are not surprised that socialist ideas are very popular in the third world, which is even more rural than Eastern Europe. But for some reason, we are surprised that in the rural part of Europe, these ideas are taking place. Well, it is not surprising. In fact, the late Tony Judd, when he wrote his best book, which nobody knows about. It's called Socialism in Provence. So he wrote, we shouldn't be surprised that socialism was very popular among peasants in Provence, and it could have actually won. And so he says we shouldn't be surprised at the amount of socialist attraction in the third world. But then we go again and we are surprised about our countries. No, we shouldn't be surprised.
Thank you for already addressing one of the questions from the audience, which had to do with this relevance of the agrarian problem for generating alternative forms of socialist thought. Now, maybe I just put it out there if the others have ideas on this. If not, there are 3 more questions. 2 of them have to do with the context, and one of them has to do with the politics of academic writing on this topic. The contextual questions, one of them has to do with the role of the rising labor movement in early 20th century America and whether it had any influence on the histories that you are telling. And the second contextual question is about the first wave of globalization at the turn of the century, and again, how that connects with your histories. Yeah, Risto, you can go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can say a word about this agrarian socialism. So as Maria already mentioned, one of the specialities of Finnish socialism was that it was so largely based on agrarian voters, and I don't think that this factor created any kind of innovative socialist theory in the Grand Duchy of Finland, but it certainly created many problems, ideological problems for the Finnish labor movement, because Finland had so many crofters, for example, who wanted to become independent. They were renting their land, and this dream from the grassroots was difficult to handle within the framework of Couchguide Marxism. And maybe I can also very briefly answer to your second question, which was about the early 20th century American labor movement. So at least in the case of Finland, this was a very important factor because lots of Finnish socialists went to America because of better working opportunities and also to escape political repression from the Russian authorities in the Grand Duchy of Finland. And there was lively interaction between Finnish socialists and the Finnish American socialists because, for example, censorship was much easier in America, so you could publish ideas and texts that could not be published in Finland. You could publish them over the ocean.
I'll add on to that briefly on the Finnish American. There's the Finnish, and there's similar with the Latvian, but the Finnish one's more analytically interesting. So you have this back and forth, but it's fascinating because in the way that historiography talks about, Finnish socialism was moderate. But if you look at the American historiography of the left, the Finnish were like the most extreme radicals you've ever heard of. Like, these are people who are going to come, like, burn down the mine workers, the mine owners' house, things like this. This would and this has to do with the Finnish ended up becoming central to the communist movement in the United States. But if you take the prehistory, it's very interesting that you have relatively parliamentary oriented Finnish socialists going to the United States and becoming more syndicalist oriented because there was actually less space in the United States at this time perceived for parliamentary action. So a lot of the Finnish socialists go and become involved in the IWW, the syndicalists essentially. And then some of them come back to Finland in like 1907, 1908, 1909, and they're like, syndicalism, have you heard of it? It's amazing, because the Finnish unions were relatively weak. It was a party oriented. And so they're like proselytizing for the, so more of a bottom up workplace oriented socialism that in some ways was more similar to Bolshevism in practice, and there was more of a iteration of, the shop floor militant, the radical strikes like this, and it didn't gain that much traction. to me, again, this shows the importance of regime context, that somehow it just didn't make sense to most working class people to have that type of orientation, given the specific context they lived in. And so you do have like 3 generations of going back and forth. And then some of the Finnish socialists after 1917-18 go back to the US after the Civil War and end up like trying to do a better job in the revolution and not doing that much of a better job in the United States, unfortunately, ultimately.
Yeah, so maybe I will take up on this and go to the question posed by Oliver Reisner, which is the question about the first wave of globalization. And actually, what Eric now told us about the transfer between Finland and the US is as well a nice example of sort of intellectual transfers done in the political mode. So I didn't sort of nail it empirically, but I have a feeling that these wave of global revolutions, which we were talking about before, like spreading worldwide after 1905, they are still more politically mediated. So these are ideas which travel, constitutional ideas, revolutionary ideas, sort of revolutionary zeal, even people who are traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, or for instance, Armenians who are moving between Ottoman Empire, Iran, and the Russian Empire, and so on and so forth. But actually, this is not directly sort of embedded in the global, like this wave of globalization on an economic level. Yeah, so there is, of course, an analytical coverage already, and there is a growing awareness of economic integration of these imperial frameworks. That Rosa Luxemburg is here, of course, the most prominent example. And quite many of these socialists would already build various alternative, let's say, spatial or geopolitical visions for the post-imperial future. So there will be competing visions of how to maintain certain economic links, for instance, in the future reconstituted imperial spaces, or how to, for instance, build a sort of international of nationalist progressive movements across the empire, which Eric as well documented. But not that much is directly embedded in this economic flows. For instance, even I was even surprised, for instance, like reading Forces of Labor, by Beverly Silver, that 1905 is not very prominent. Of course, as well, we don't have exact data for instance, strike activities, which would be like directly comparable with the rest of the world. But as I say, I still think that the mode of transfer was still more political. Thank you.
Just a brief note to this question about the American movement. Just like with Finland, there was a huge Bulgarian emigration, mostly from Macedonia, labor emigration between the early 1900s until the First World War, and they actually joined the American labor movement. They joined the LSP, Daniel de Leon was their hero, but some of them joined the Wobblies also, a smaller part, but this was the major part. I wouldn't say that it had, so they did join, they were part of the American labor movement. In some ways, this was their way to Americanize, but very many of them returned, and I have not noted any direct influence of America. And in general, I would say the Second International, although the Americans were they came in later, they were looked at as a little bit strange because of the strong Christian element in their socialism. So it was not that strong of an influence.
We are nearing the end of our discussion, but I would still like to ask you one question from the audience. This is coming from Olena Lubchenko, and it's a question that very much brings us back to the terrible turn of our own century. Olena asks, with the war in Ukraine, there have been calls on to decolonize former state socialist countries. And her question is, how does the notion of research into borderland socialism relate to this idea of decolonizing socialisms? And then she puts maybe in parentheses, but I do want to invite you to reflect on how these histories speak to what we are now experiencing.
This is Eric's contribution to the field to call all these socialisms anti-colonial. So, yeah, sorry for pointing at you.
I'll do a brief answer. It's interesting, coming out of anti-racist politics in the United States, my initial entry point into this history was trying to look for debates on the national question, to look for like a different trajectory of Marxists looking through national liberation. And to be honest, over the course of researching the book, I moved away from that paradigm because I found it to be less rooted in the sources and less analytically helpful to think of sort of like a uniquely distinct peripheral Marxism that understood the national question, national liberation in a way that imperial socialists didn't. It was just, there was so much more reciprocity between the core and the periphery, or borderland center, on these questions that if anything, my book pushes back a little bit on the tendency of historians in like Eastern Europe in particular to look at their national traditions as somehow counterposed to either Bolshevism or German socialism, and to look at the like interpenetration as a theoretical sort of synthesis is much more useful. In fact, the national question was heavily debated and understood, and you can have different takes on this, but it's not the case that in the way it's normally talked about, that there was this sort of imperial, I don't think there was this imperial socialism that just ran roughshod over the socialism of the periphery, and then strategically we have to reject one to be able to uphold the other. So I would push back on the idea that there's this sort of lost tradition of specifically on the question of decolonizing Marxism or socialism. I think it's better to take a broader take on it.
Should I respond to this question by anonymny dostavljac at Maria? Well, actually, the strongest and most efficient socialist movement was in the country where the bourgeoisie was strong, and this is Germany. So it's not that is not so, this correlation is not so clear. And of course, all socialist movements, being rather dogmatic, wanted to create a bourgeoisie because this was the script, right?
Thank you, Maria. And with this, I think we cover all the questions. And I think this discussion opened so many more. I see that Risto is happy that we're nearing the end, as Finland is approaching midnight soon. Yes. So I will just take this opportunity to thank you all again for introducing your books and for having this discussion here. And also just to take this opportunity to very, very warmly recommend